Hi, this is Andrew with Range CNC. Today we're going to be talking about vacuum zones on the CNC, some of the history of how that has changed over, even the last 5 or 10 years, and some of the advantages of having a controller-driven vacuum system versus a system where the operator is manually turning that on and off, or even just from the machine itself. So there's really at this point two main ways that you see machines utilizing vacuums. And this will pertain primarily to 4x8s and 5x10s and 5x12s, but just that size. I would say in the more industrial sized machines, you see an industrial controller, maybe a Syntec, a Fagor, a Fanuc, a Siemens, and those are controlling those valves for you. And so your pump is on, and that is being ported to the machine itself. And then under that machine, there's piping that is going to zones that are on top of the table. And so depending on how many zones you have, that normally will dictate how many pipes you've got running underneath there. And so I would say it's pretty normal for a 4x8 to be a 2 or 4 zone, and a 5x10 you typically see a 6 zone or a 7 zone, depending on how that is laid out. And normally a 5x10 will have a 4x8 zoned area so that you could utilize the 5x10 as a 4x8. And it will then also have zones on the side and on the top. And so again, depending on how those are broken up on the side would determine if it's a 6 zone or a 7 zone. The two ways then that you see these zones being opened and closed is either with knobs at the front, or the controller is driven, has got, essentially think of it as knobs underneath the machine that are driven by an air cylinder, and that's opening and closing that valve. And so there are a lot of advantages to having the controller be able to control these valves for you. Outside of any of these two setups, normally you'll have your pump on the whole time. And so if you are cutting, 5 or 6 hours, you'll leave your vacuum pump on, and then you'll simply close the zones at the CNC rather than turning the pump on and off. This is better for the life of the pump. Most pumps are designed, like most motor-based things, to turn on and just run rather than a lot of heavy start stops. Certainly that's not the case for every motor, but most vacuum pumps are designed, and that's for the longevity of the pump and just motors in general. So when you have the CNC controlling those zones, on the front range machine, we've got a touch screen, and the operator can hit the zones, and they can either close individual zones. So if it's a 7 zone, there would be 7 buttons that they can open and close each of the 7 individually, or they can open and close the main valve, which would essentially dictate whether the whole system gets vacuumed or not. And this is really nice because at the end of cutting a sheet, you would simply touch screen, which would close the main valve, and now you can take your sheet off, rather than the operator having to twist 4 zones or 5 zones to close them all, or manually twist a main valve to close it. If you have it on an air setup like this, it's a little bit easier over the life of the machine, as well as the life of that operator having to cut 10 or 20 sheets that day, having to manually do all that. The other advantage is that you can then have these into an M code setup. And an M code is a manufacturer-specific code that is just running some macro of doing XYZ. So you might see M codes for measuring a tool, or you might see an M code for inputting a certain parameter somewhere. In the case of if the vacuum valves are driven by the controller, you can have an M code in for each zone, or open closed main zone. So if you've got CNCs now, or maybe even if you are looking to get a router, this is really helpful, not only from the benefit of saving your operator from needing to manually open and close, but you can now have an M code that we can help put into your post-processor, whether it's VCarve, Mosaic, Fusion, whatever software you're doing, and we can make the machine open the zone, the main zone before you start cutting your program. And the advantage is, if you think your operator might forget, or maybe they have forgotten and you already have machines, this can then help prevent that from happening. The other thing is then having these on M codes, you're able to also close them intelligently at the end of the sheet. We recommend that the operator is manually turning that sheet off rather than have the program close the valves for you at the end of the sheet. The reason is, if you've measured your material and it comes out at 0.72, let's pretend, and let's say you forgot to surface your spoil board, or maybe you have a new operator, who knows what. If you've just cut that sheet, you want to check at least on those first couple of runs to make sure that you're cutting all the way through that sheet. Now, if you have surfaced your spoil board on both sides, that essentially guarantees you a zero height. But there are still times where maybe you have a lot of moisture, the heights are a little off. So it is helpful to have the human check that so that you can make sure that you have cut all the way through. We think it's a really helpful feature. We've all run machines without it, and so we've been that person opening and closing 4 valves for 20 sheets a day. And it's not the end of the world, but if you're buying an industrial style machine, that is a feature that is really handy. That is simple to use and is really good. If you do have any questions, about the vacuum valve and zone setup and just kind of how that works in general, feel free to call us or send us an email. We'd be happy to elaborate and just brainstorm more options with you. Thank you.